Using the wrong controller settings can be the difference between dropping high kill games or getting slammed. And you can't just copy someone else's settings because everyone uses different controllers and has different playstyles. So today, I'm going to share with you step by step exactly how I adjust my sensitivity, and I'm also going to show you my controller settings which allow me to get more kills. Now before we get into the settings, you have to know that there's one aiming skill that separates the great players from everyone else. This skill is really important because it allows you to get the critical first shots in a gunfight, and it gives you a higher probability of getting the kill. And this aiming skill is your centering, or your crosshair placement. If you watch any good player play, they have complete control over their crosshair and they move it back and forth between areas of the map where they think an enemy will appear. And this is actually more difficult than it seems because you don't get aim assists when there aren't any enemies around. So in other words, you need to have complete control over your crosshair without any aim assists. And that's why I use my centering to find my controller sensitivity. First, I stand 10 to 15 meters away from a wall with two targets next to one another, and I bounce my crosshair back and forth between each target. Now my speed really isn't that important. What I'm looking at is how accurate I am and if I'm overshooting or undershooting the targets. Now I'm doing this in multiplayer in a custom map, but there are a lot of buildings and plunders with windows very similar to this. So while I'm doing this, I'm adjusting my sensitivity until I get something that feels right, and I'm giving myself about a minute or so at each sense. And I just adjust up and down based on how accurate I am. The general rule of thumb is you want to play at the highest sensitivity you can without sacrificing aiming control or consistency. The higher your sensitivity, the more difficult it is to control. Also, I repeat this step in the vertical direction. I just find two targets that are stacked on top of one another, and then I repeat what I was doing before. Now I always use the same horizontal and vertical stick sensitivities, but there are some people out there who don't. So it's up to you on what you use. Now after I find a sense that feels good, I put my back to the wall, and then I practice doing 180s and centering to one of the targets. There's going to be a lot of times in Warzone where I'm getting shot in the back, and I have to turn around really quickly, so I want a sensitivity that's fast enough to do that. And just to be clear, I never expect to have perfect accuracy when I'm doing these tests. I'm just looking for the max sensitivity that I can use where my aim doesn't completely fall apart and start to get wild. This is pretty subjective, but if I can be within a couple meters of each target most of the time, then I feel pretty good about the sensitivity. And then after spending 5 or 10 minutes doing these tests, I then go on to something that I call follow the bot. I load into a custom game with some bots, or I hop into Plunder, and I just follow my teammates around while trying to keep my crosshair centered at their chest. I think this is a great drill for practicing your centering because it helps you visualize the player models as they move around the map, but it's also good for dialing in the right sensitivity. This step really gives me a good idea for how much control I have over my crosshair because I have to track a moving target without any aim assists, which is pretty hard. And one thing to note is that the closer they are, the harder it is to track. So I generally like to stay pretty close to my targets and make it as difficult as possible. And then once I've found a comfortable sensitivity, I move on to finding my ADS multiplier. This is the coefficient that slows down or speeds up your sensitivity when you're ADS on an opponent. Now this is a little bit trickier to find in my opinion, but what I like to do is similar to the last step, and I just follow my teammates around and I try to track them. And just like before, I adjust the multiplier until my aim feels comfortable and consistent. In a normal situation, you're gonna have aim assist on your opponent, so just keep that in mind because this is gonna be pretty hard. Now it's up to you how long you spend on each step, but after I've done all this testing, I like to get into a lot of gunfights to make sure my sensitivity and settings feel right in an actual game. Ideally, I like to test them out at close ranges and long ranges to make sure that I'm ready for any scenario that I find myself in. Now ideally, it's good to do this whole process a couple of days in a row because your aim, just like any other skill, can vary from day to day. So by doing this for a couple of days, you should get a pretty good average of what settings feel right. And now here comes the hard part. I highly recommend locking in these settings once you've found them. You have to trust that all this testing did its job, and now you need to forget it and focus on improving in the game. No one talks about it, but the perfect settings don't actually exist. If you're a great player, you can be very successful on almost any sensitivity. I actually tested this out for myself a few years ago. At the time, I was playing on 7.7, but I switched to 2020 for a couple of games, and after I got used to it, I started to play pretty well, and I even almost got a 20 kill win. The point is, once you've found a comfortable sensitivity, you just need to spend the time aim training and developing the fine motor skills in your hand for better accuracy and consistency. If you switch your sense too much early on, you make it so much harder to develop good hand-eye coordination and good muscle memory. But the good news is, from what I've found, once you put the time in and master your aim at one sensitivity, you can easily change it down the road and still be really successful. I currently play on 1.8 with a 0.85 ADS multiplier, but that could certainly change in a couple of months. So don't stress out too much about what you're starting at now. Just pick something that's comfortable and consistent. And for complete beginners to Call of Duty, I would just recommend using 1.6 at a 1.0 ADS multiplier and put a few months into playing the game before you follow these steps. Okay, so moving on to dead zones. These are the settings that specify how much you have to move your thumbsticks or your triggers before the game registers an input. For the max maximums, I set the right stick to 99 because I want the full range of motion of the thumbstick when I'm aiming, and for the left stick I set it to 60 because I want to hit my full sprint speed sooner when I move the left thumbstick. But where you put the minimums comes down to your controller. For the triggers, you just want to set this as low as possible so that the game isn't registering any false inputs without you pressing the buttons. And for the sticks, if you've ever used a controller, I'm sure you know that stick drift is a huge design flaw. The conventional wisdom is to stand still and up the minimum dead zone until you no longer get stick drift. But I actually don't like doing this. I set my dead zones to the minimum value of 0 because I want my controller to register an input as soon as I move the thumbstick. This gives me the most amount of control over my aim, and I'm okay with a little bit of stick drift to get this control. Now if you put this to the minimum value and your stick drift gets crazy, it's probably time to get a new controller. So the controller that I use is from Beaver, and I have a controller with 4 back buttons as well as the digital mouse click triggers, so there's very little travel when I press my trigger buttons, and that helps me just have a faster response when I'm in gunfights because my trigger is going to be as responsive as possible. Now the reason that I have 4 back buttons is I don't want to constantly be moving my right thumb off of the analog stick to press these face buttons. So I have these 4 back buttons bound to jump, slide, reload, and weapon swap. And the reason that I use back buttons is I find gripping my controller like this is the most comfortable, but a lot of other players will play claw, where basically they move their index fingers off of the bumpers and triggers and they press their face buttons like this. I don't find this very comfortable, but that definitely is an option that a lot of players do. And what's great about Beaver is you can actually get these face buttons to be mouse click buttons as well, so that when you press them, it has a really fast clicky response versus a standard controller that has more of a squishy, longer travel time for the button presses. And if you do want to support the channel and you need a new controller, I'm partnered with Beaver, who in my opinion is the absolute best controller company on the market, and you can use code dreamstrike for 10% off your order. Okay, and these are the controller settings that I use, and you can feel free to copy these down if you'd like.